The echoes of Maple Hollow. Deep in the heart of Maple Hollow, an ancient forest cradled in the mountains, autumn had just begun to paint the world in hues of red and gold. The crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and for four friends, Chris, Tara, Mike, and Erin, this camping trip was supposed to be an escape from their bustling lives. They had set up camp near a secluded lake, the trees forming a natural barrier from the outside world. The first night was uneventful. Laughter echoed around the fire, and they shared ghost stories that felt harmless under the watchful gaze of the moon. But as the flames flickered low and their voices grew hushed, an unsettling quiet crept over the woods. Even the wind, which had been softly rustling the branches, seemed to die. There was a stillness thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. "I swear I heard something," Erin whispered, her eyes darting toward the trees. The others dismissed it as the normal sounds of nature, but the silence lingered. The second day was colder, the sky hanging low with dark clouds. The group decided to hike deeper into the woods, following an overgrown trail they had found near the lake. As they ventured farther from camp, the trees grew denser and the underbrush thickened. It felt like they were being swallowed by the forest. They came across an old, weathered sign half buried in the leaves. The words were almost unreadable, but Mike knelt down, brushing dirt from the wood. "Beware of Echo Hollow," he read aloud, laughing. "Looks like someone tried to scare off campers." Still, the others couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Tara noticed strange markings on the trees, symbols carved deep into the bark, too deliberate to be natural. The deeper they went, the more of these markings they saw. A few times, they caught the sound of faint whispering, as though the wind carried voices. But there was no wind. That night, around the fire, the tension was palpable. Mike tried to lighten the mood by cracking jokes, but his voice faltered when they heard it. A low hum, distant but growing closer. At first, they thought it was the wind again, but this was different. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. Tara stood up, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a loud crack split the air, a tree branch snapping underfoot. Chris grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. For a moment, there was nothing but the glow of leaves illuminated in the beam. But then, movement. A shadow, long and unnatural, slipped between the trees. "Who's there?" Mike called out, trying to sound brave. But no one answered. By the time they decided to retreat into their tents, nerves were frayed. Chris and Erin shared one tent, while Mike and Tara took the other. But sleep did not come easily. Chris lay awake, listening to the rustling outside, the occasional snap of twigs, and the persistent feeling that something was out there, just beyond the thin fabric of their tent. At some point in the night, Erin woke him, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "Chris," she whispered, "listen." He strained his ears and heard it, a soft voice, barely audible, right outside the tent. It was whispering his name. Suddenly, from the other tent, there was a scream. Mike burst out, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Something touched me," he gasped. It whispered in my ear. Morning came, but it offered no comfort. The group hastily decided to pack up and leave. But as they were breaking camp, they discovered something that froze their blood. Surrounding their tents were more of those strange carvings, etched into the ground in a perfect circle. No one had noticed them the night before. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. They hurried, shoving sleeping bags and supplies into their packs, desperate to get away. But the forest, it seemed, had other plans. The trail back to the car was different. The path that had been clear when they arrived was now overgrown, almost unrecognizable. The markings on the trees had spread, following them no matter which direction they turned. The whispering had returned, louder now, as if the forest itself was alive with voices. As the sky darkened with the approach of evening, panic set in. They were lost. The trail looped back on itself, leading them in circles. Every so often, they caught glimpses of figures, shadowy forms slipping through the trees, watching them. By the time they stumbled upon the lake again, night had fallen. They were back where they had started. Exhausted and terrified, they decided to stay by the water, hoping daylight would offer a way out. That night, the whispering became a cacophony. It surrounded them, pressing in from all sides. The fire they had built was struggling to stay lit, the flames sputtering against the damp air. And then, from the trees, they saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, stepped into the flickering light. Its face was a mask of decay, eyes black as pitch. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the group, and in a voice that echoed from the deepest corners of the forest, it spoke a single word. Stay. The fire died. Darkness swallowed them whole. When the search party arrived days later, they'd found the campsite near the lake. The tents were empty, supplies left behind as though the campers had vanished in the middle of the night. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the site, just the strange carvings in the dirt and the echo of the wind through the trees, carrying faint whispers of names long forgotten. The cabin at Hollow Creek. There's a legend that haunts the quiet town of Willow Glen, passed down from generation to generation. It's about an old cabin tucked deep in the Hollow Creek woods, a place where the trees grow too thick and the fog never seems to lift. For most, it was just a story, a spooky tale to scare children during the cold autumn nights. But for Ben, Kelly, and their friends, it became something much more sinister. It was a chilly October when the group decided to rent the cabin for a weekend getaway. Ben had heard of the place from an old family friend who used to hike in the area. It's perfect, he had said. Secluded, quiet, no phone service, no distractions. They couldn't have asked for a better escape from their hectic lives. Little did they know, Hollow Creek had other plans. The road to the cabin was long and winding, cutting through the dense woods. By the time they arrived, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the land. The cabin was old, much older than they had expected. Its wood was weathered, the windows clouded with dust. Yet, despite its age, there was something unsettlingly well preserved about it, like it had been waiting for them. The first night passed quietly enough. They lit a fire, poured drinks, and settled in. The air inside the cabin was cold, colder than it should have been, but they chalked it up to the thin walls and the creeping chill of fall. Laughter filled the small space as they told stories, the crackling of the fire masking the subtle creaks and groans of the old building. But that night, Ben woke suddenly. The fire had long since died, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. The cabin was silent, save for the soft breathing of his friends. But there was something else just beneath the quiet, a low rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he realized it was coming from beneath the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Ben held his breath, listening intently. The tapping continued for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly. He lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to return. But the silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, Kelly found something odd. In the kitchen, near the old wooden counter, a series of small, muddy footprints led from the back door and stopped right in front of the sink. They were too small to be any of theirs, like a child had walked through the cabin during the night. But there were no children nearby, and the door had been locked. Ben's unease grew, but the others brushed it off. Probably just an animal, Sam suggested, or the old floorboards shifting. They'd all tried to laugh it off, but the cabin seemed different in the daylight. The air inside was thick, heavy with a feeling none of them could shake. The woods outside, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed too close, their branches like twisted arms reaching toward the cabin. They decided to explore the area, hoping the fresh air would clear their heads. The forest was dense, the path winding through ancient trees draped in moss. As they walked, they noticed strange things, old, rotting furniture half buried in the ground, rusted tools hanging from the trees, as if someone had once lived here, deep in the woods. But that had been a long time ago. At one point, Kelly stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others paused, listening. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of children's laughter, distant and echoing through the trees. "There's no one out here," Ben said, his voice tight. "There can't be." That night, the cabin felt colder than before. The fire did little to warm the space, and a dampness clung to the air. They locked the doors and windows, trying to ignore the growing tension. But as they sat by the fire, the sounds began again. This time, it was clearer. The soft pattering of footsteps, moving through the walls, up and down the hallways. It was as though someone, or something, was walking just beyond their sight, just out of reach. Ben grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to check it out," he muttered, trying to sound braver than he felt. Kelly grabbed his arm. "Don't," she pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. But he couldn't stand the sound anymore. He had to know. The others followed him as he searched the cabin, checking every room, every corner. There was nothing, no sign of anyone else. But when they returned to the main room, they found something chilling. On the floor, etched in the dust, were the same small, muddy footprints they had seen earlier. But this time, they'd formed a trail leading directly to the fireplace. They tried to leave the next morning, but the car wouldn't start. It was an old model, but it had worked fine when they arrived. Now, the engine sputtered and died no matter how many times they tried to turn it over. The tension grew. The whispering in the woods had returned, louder now, as though the trees themselves were speaking in hushed, frantic voices. Kelly swore she saw figures in the woods, children, peeking out from behind the trees, watching them. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, the tapping returned, louder than before. It came from beneath the floorboards, that moved to the walls surrounding them. Ben and Sam tore at the old planks, desperate to find the source. But as they pried open the floorboards near the fireplace, they uncovered something that stopped them cold. Beneath the cabin, buried in the dirt, were bones, small bones, child-sized. The next morning, a search party found the cabin. The car was still parked outside, and the front door was open, swinging gently in the autumn breeze. Inside, the fire had long since died, and the rooms were empty. No signs of struggle. No signs of the four friends who had come there for a weekend of peace. All that remained were the footprints, small, muddy prints, leading from the back door, circling the rooms, and disappearing into the woods. The trees, as always, stood silent, watching, as the whispers of Hollow Creek faded into the wind. The vanishing trail. In the rolling hills of upstate New York, where the autumn leaves burn red and gold, there is a hiking trail that the locals avoid once the seasons begin to change. Known simply as the Vanishing Trail, it wends through the thickest part of the forest, where the sun barely breaks through the canopy and the nights come swiftly. No one speaks of it openly, but rumors swirl around town about those who wandered too far along the path and never returned. Rachel, Tom, Sarah, and Luke had heard the stories growing up, but never took them seriously. After all, they were just tales to scare children, passed around campfires during Halloween. So, when they planned their annual fall camping trip, the four of them laughed off the warnings and decided to set up camp near the infamous trail. They arrived late in the afternoon, the light already beginning to fade. The trees, skeletal and bare in places, stretched overhead like clawing fingers. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. They'd found a clearing not far from the trail and pitched their tents, eager to prove that the old stories were nothing more than myth. That evening, as the fire crackled and popped, Luke brought out a map he had downloaded of the area. "Look at this," he said, his finger tracing the line of the vanishing trail. "It's supposed to be a 3-hour hike tops. I say we try it tomorrow and settle this once and for all." Rachel shook her head. "I don't know, guys. People say there's something off about that place. Like they feel lost even though they're following the path." She glanced at the others, hoping someone would agree. But Sarah and Tom laughed. "Come on, Rach," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "We're here to enjoy ourselves, not get scared by fairy tales. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, Rachel agreed. They toasted marshmallows, shared ghost stories, and soon the eerie legends of the vanishing trail were forgotten amid their laughter. But as the fire began to die down and the cold crept in, an unnatural stillness settled over the campsite. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Rachel was the first to notice it. "Is it me, or has everything stopped?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom shrugged. "It's just the woods. Probably just hit that weird quiet time between dusk and dark." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She swore she could feel something watching them from beyond the firelight, just at the edge of the trees. Something unseen, lurking. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The next morning, they set out early, the chill of the night still clinging to the air. The trail started out simple enough. A dirt path lined with fallen leaves, winding gently through the trees. The vibrant colors of autumn surrounded them, and the sound of crunching leaves beneath their boots was the only noise that broke the silence. But after about an hour, things began to change. The trees grew denser, the canopy above thickening until barely a sliver of sunlight reached the forest floor. The path, once clear, became faint, as if the forest was trying to swallow it whole. And the further they walked, the quieter the woods became. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the oppressive silence, deep and consuming. "I don't like this," Rachel muttered under her breath, glancing nervously at the trees. "Something feels wrong." Luke, who had been leading the way, stopped abruptly. "Wait a second," he said, frowning down at the map. "We should have hit a clearing by now." Sarah peered over his shoulder. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Luke nodded, though doubt crept into his voice. "Yeah, I think so." They continued on, but the more they walked, the more lost they felt. The trail seemed to shift beneath their feet, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The trees all looked the same, their bark scarred with strange symbols, patterns that none of them had noticed before. By midday, the sun was hidden completely behind thick clouds, casting the forest in an eerie gray light. The map was useless now. Luke kept looking at it, turning it in his hands, but no matter which direction they walked, the trail led them nowhere. Hours passed, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Every now and then, Sarah would swear she'd heard footsteps behind them, but when they stopped to listen, there was nothing. Just that suffocating quiet. "I think we should turn back," Tom said, his voice tight. "We're not getting anywhere." But when they tried to retrace their steps, the trail was gone. The path they had been following had vanished, replaced by thick underbrush and fallen branches that hadn't been there moments before. Rachel's heart began to pound. What's happening? Where's the trail?" Luke, looking pale, checked the map again. "I don't know. It's like it's moving, changing." The trees seemed to close in on them, the forest growing darker, colder. Shapes shifted in the shadows, too quick to see clearly but always there, just beyond their vision. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, as if the forest itself was alive, and it did not want them to leave. As night fell, the group became frantic. They stumbled through the woods, calling out to one another as the darkness swallowed them. The forest, once a quiet sanctuary, had turned into a maze. No matter which way they went, they ended up back where they started. And then the whispers began. Low at first, like the wind moving through the trees, but there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking in a language none of them understood. The shadows moved with purpose now, darting between the trees, watching, waiting. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. They turned to see her standing frozen, staring into the trees. "There!" she cried, pointing with a trembling hand. "I saw someone." But when they looked, there was no one there, just the shifting shadows and the feeling of something watching them. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Rachel, separated from the others in the chaos, wandered through the darkened forest, her heart pounding in her chest. She could no longer hear their voices, only the whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. At some point, she stumbled upon the trail again, or what she thought was the trail. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but it stretched out before her like a lifeline. With trembling hands, she followed it, hoping beyond hope that it would lead her back to the campsite. But as she walked, the path began to twist again, leading her in circles, deeper and deeper into the forest. She could feel the presence behind her, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. The trees seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against her from all sides. Days later, a search party was sent into the woods after the group failed to return. They'd found the campsite untouched, the tents still standing, the fire pit cold. But there was no sign of Rachel, Tom, Luke, or Sarah. The trail itself was overgrown, as if no one had walked it in years. Locals shook their heads, muttering about the old legends. "The vanishing trail," they said. "Once you step too far, the forest keeps you." And though they never spoke of it openly, some of the searchers swore they heard whispers on the wind as they left the forest, faint voices calling out names that had long since been forgotten. The Harvest Men. In a small forgotten town nestled between two mountain ranges, there is a legend that emerges every autumn when the cornfields grow tall and the air turns sharp with the bite of the season. They call them the Harvest Men, shadowy figures that appear at dusk, their lanky forms moving silently between the rows of corn. It's said they come for those who wander too close to the fields at night, drawn by something dark and ancient. For years, it was nothing more than a story to scare kids out of mischief. But for Maya, Dylan, and their friends, it was the story that marked the beginning of something far more terrifying. The town was dying, slowly fading as its population dwindled, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned farms. But the harvest season always brought a strange energy to the place, as though the land itself was alive, awakening for just a short time before the frost claimed it again. The annual fall festival was supposed to be one last hurrah for the year, a time for celebration and distraction. Maya and Dylan were ready for a night of laughter, bonfires, and maybe a little mischief. They had heard the whispers about the harvest men since they were kids. The adults always warned them to stay away from the cornfields at night, claiming the old stories were based on something real, something that the town had long tried to forget. But to a group of teenagers, it was nothing more than a challenge. That night, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the fields. The festival was in full swing, lights strung up around the town square, music blaring from speakers, and the smell of roasting food in the air. But as the evening wore on, Maya and Dylan found themselves drawn away from the crowd, toward the edge of the town where the cornfields stretched out like an endless maze. Tom and Emily followed close behind, half laughing, half nervous. "Are we really doing this?" Emily asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and fear. Maya grinned, pushing through the stalks of corn, the dry husks crackling beneath her fingers. "Come on, it's just a stupid story. You're not scared, are you?" "No, of course not," Dylan said, but there was hesitation in his voice as they moved deeper into the field. The air between the rows was thick, almost suffocating. The further they walked, the quieter it became, the sounds of the festival fading behind them until all that remained was the rustling of the corn and their own footsteps. The moonlight barely reached them now, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally between the stalks. After a while, the group stopped. Maya, suddenly uneasy, glanced over her shoulder. The entrance to the field was gone, hidden behind the towering corn, which now seemed much taller than before. "Okay, maybe we should head back," she said, trying to sound casual, but her heart was starting to race. Tom snorted. "What? You're the one who wanted to come out here. Now you're scared." Before she could answer, Emily shushed them, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" At first they didn't, but then faintly it came, a soft rustling, like something moving through the corn. The sound wasn't coming from them. It was distant, but growing closer, weaving between the rows, circling them. "Probably just the wind," Dylan said, though he didn't sound convinced. They stood frozen for a moment listening. But there was no wind. And the rustling continued, moving with a deliberate pace, like footsteps brushing against the dry stalks. "We should go," Maya whispered, her throat tight with fear now. Without another word, they turned and began moving quickly through the field, but the path that had been so clear minutes before was now a maze. The corn seemed to shift around them, the rows blending into one another. And that sound, those footsteps, were getting closer. They began to run, pushing through the corn in a panic, desperate to find a way out. But the faster they moved, the more disoriented they became. It was as though the field was alive, twisting and turning, trapping them in a labyrinth of stalks and shadows. Dylan was the first to fall. One moment he was right behind Maya, and the next he had vanished, swallowed by the darkness between the rows. "Dylan?" Maya called, her voice shaking. "Dylan." Tom cursed under his breath, turning back to look for him. But when they found the spot where Dylan had disappeared, there was nothing. No trace of him, no broken stalks, no footprints in the dirt. Just empty space where he had been moments before. "We need to leave now," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. They started running again, but the sound followed them. The rustling, that soft, deliberate noise, was all around them now, closing in. Maya felt the air thicken with dread, a deep, primal fear rising in her chest. She knew they weren't alone in the field anymore. The first shadow appeared just beyond the edge of her vision, a tall, thin figure, its body almost blending with the corn. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was standing there, unmoving, watching them. Tom saw it too. What the hell is that?" he stammered, backing away slowly. Another figure appeared on the opposite side, emerging silently from the rows of corn. They were grotesque, their limbs impossibly long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their bodies seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, barely solid, more shadow than substance. The harvest men! Emily screamed, but it was cut short as one of the figures lunged forward, faster than anything human should be able to move. Tom grabbed her hand, pulling her through the corn, but it was no use. The figures were everywhere now, moving in perfect silence, their bodies slipping between the stalks like smoke. Maya ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear Tom and Emily behind her, their panicked breathing mixing with the growing rustling of the corn. But she didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see them, the shadowy figures creeping closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. When she burst out of the field, gasping for air, the town was eerily quiet. The lights of the festival were still glowing in the distance, but the sounds of music and laughter were gone. She stumbled, collapsing onto the dirt path, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But when she turned to look back at the field, she was alone. Tom and Emily were gone, swallowed by the corn. The rows stood tall and silent, unmoving in the still night air, as though nothing had ever disturbed them. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something at the edge of the field. There, standing just beyond the rows of corn, were the shadowy figures, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. They stood motionless, watching her, and though their faces were featureless, she could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. The next morning, the town was buzzing with whispers. Search parties combed the cornfields, but there was no sign of Dylan, Tom, or Emily. No broken stalks, no footprints, just the empty, silent rows stretching on forever. Maya never spoke of what she saw in the field that night, but as the harvest season drew to a close and the fields were cleared for winter, she knew. She knew that the harvest men were still out there, waiting for the next night when someone wandered too far into the corn. And in the quiet, cold darkness of the autumn nights, when the wind brushes softly through the remaining stalks, she swore she could still hear the rustling, the sound of something or someone moving silently through the rows, watching, waiting for the next harvest. The lantern of Black Hollow Woods. Black Hollow Woods was a place forgotten by time. The trees there grew twisted and gnarled, their bark darkened by age and rot. No one in the nearby town ever ventured there, especially not after nightfall. It was said that the woods had a mind of their own, that they shifted and bent, leading those foolish enough to enter deeper into their depths, never to return. But what people feared most about Black Hollow was the lantern. The story went that on cold autumn nights, a flickering lantern could be seen deep within the forest, swaying gently, as though carried by an unseen hand. And those who followed it? They never came back. It was one of those nights when the wind carried the scent of dying leaves, and the sky hung heavy with clouds that Lily, Erin, and David decided to test the legend. They had grown up hearing the tales from their grandparents, stories about strange lights in the woods, about people who had gone missing over the years. But they were older now, practically adults, and eager to prove the old stories were nothing but superstition. You really believe that nonsense? Erin asked with a grin as they stood at the edge of Black Hollow, flashlights in hand. His breath fogged in the chilly air, but the bravado in his voice betrayed his nerves. Lily shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. I don't know. Something about this place. I don't like it. David smirked. Come on, we've hiked this area 100 times. It's just trees. There's no lantern ghost waiting to take us. They stepped into the woods, the crunch of fallen leaves loud beneath their feet. The further they went, the more the world outside seemed to fade away. The air grew colder, heavier. The trees here were closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands, blocking out the sky. The silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. Hours passed, and the deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they became. What had started as a simple exploration now felt like a labyrinth. The flashlight beams seemed weaker, barely cutting through the thick, unnatural darkness that surrounded them. Are we lost? Lily whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. No, David replied, though there was uncertainty in his tone. We just need to keep going. But the trees all looked the same, twisting into strange, grotesque shapes. The path they had followed was gone, swallowed by the woods. Erin checked his phone for the map, but there was no signal. Not even the time showed on the screen anymore. Then, just ahead, something caught their attention. A faint, warm glow. A flickering light swaying gently in the distance, just visible through the trees. Lily's stomach twisted. Is that? The lantern, Erin whispered, the excitement in his voice laced with fear. It's real. Without waiting for a response, he hurried toward it, drawn like a moth to a flame. Lily and David hesitated, but they followed, too curious, too scared to let Erin go alone. The closer they got, the stranger the light became. It flickered with an unnatural rhythm, almost as if it were alive. The air around it was warmer, but with the heat came a suffocating stillness, as though they had stepped into a place that did not belong to the world they knew. Erin stopped abruptly, the light just ahead of them now, hanging in the air between two trees. It swayed, beckoning, but there was no figure, no hand holding it, just the lantern. Maybe we should go back, Lily said, her voice trembling. Erin turned to her, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. Don't you feel it? He asked. It's calling us. David grabbed his arm. Erin, stop. This isn't right. We need to get out of here. But Erin shook him off, stepping closer to the light. As he reached out to touch it, the wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees with a sound like distant laughter. The lantern's light flared, blinding for a moment, and then, just like that, it vanished. The darkness that followed was crushing. The temperature dropped so sharply that their breath came out in clouds, and the silence returned, even heavier than before. But Erin was gone. Lily screamed his name, her voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. David shone his flashlight in every direction, but all they saw were endless rows of twisted, blackened trees. Erin had been standing right in front of them. And now he was simply gone. We have to go, David whispered urgently, grabbing Lily's hand. Now. They turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the woods had changed. The trees seemed to move with them, shifting and closing in, turning the path they had come from into an endless maze. Every step they took felt like they were running in circles, the same twisted branches, the same gnarled trunks looming in the darkness. And then they saw it again. The lantern. It flickered just ahead of them, casting its soft glow over the trees, swaying gently like before. But this time, something was different. Something was standing in the shadows behind the light. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was pale, featureless, except for two hollow, glowing eyes. It stood there, unmoving, its gaze fixed on them. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. What is that? David pulled her back, panic rising in his voice. Don't look at it, just run. But they couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The lantern followed it, floating beside it like a loyal servant. And as it drew closer, the air around them grew colder, the light flickering wildly. Lily could feel it now, the pull of the lantern tugging at her mind, whispering in a voice she couldn't understand. It was calling them, leading them deeper into the woods, to a place where the light never reached. Desperate, David grabbed a branch and swung at the lantern, trying to break whatever hold it had over them. The moment he did, the light exploded into a shower of sparks, and the figure let out a terrible guttural sound, a mixture of a scream and a roar that shook the very ground beneath them. Without thinking, they ran. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the cold biting at their skin, but they ran faster than they ever had before. Behind them, the sound of the lantern creature grew fainter, but they could still feel it, watching, waiting for them to slow, to stop. They didn't. When they finally stumbled out of Black Hollow, gasping for air, the sky was lightening with the first rays of dawn. They collapsed onto the dirt road, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their minds numb with terror. Erin was gone, and the lantern, that cursed light, was still somewhere in the woods, waiting for the next fool to follow it. In the days that followed, the townspeople whispered about what had happened, but no one dared go into Black Hollow to search for Erin. They knew what had taken him. They knew the woods didn't give back what they took. And late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the fog crept low across the fields, if you listened closely enough, you could hear it, the faint flicker of a lantern swaying in the distance, and the soft, mournful whispers of those lost forever in Black Hollow woods. The faces in the fog. There's a place just off the main highway, nestled in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog never seems to lift. Even on the clearest days, the mist lingers low over the ground, curling around trees and creeping across the narrow roads. Locals call it Fog Hollow, and they don't talk about it much. There's an unspoken rule in the nearby town: you don't go into Fog Hollow after dark, and you don't look too long at the shapes in the mist. Tessa, Logan, and Mark had heard the stories growing up, but like most people their age, they thought they were just small-town superstitions. Tales about people disappearing into the fog, only to return days later, or not at all. It was something to laugh about, to tell newcomers as a joke. But there was always a grain of hesitation in the locals' laughter, a flicker of fear behind their eyes. That's why when the three friends decided to spend the weekend camping near Fog Hollow, the older folks in town gave them knowing looks. They tried to warn them, though none of them said outright what was wrong with the place. Logan shrugged it off, tossing their gear into the back of his truck. It's just fog, guys. How bad can it be? They arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sky already dimming with the heavy clouds that rolled in from the mountains. The mist was thick as they pulled into the clearing, shrouding the trees and muffling the sounds of the world around them. It wrapped around the truck as they parked, clinging to the windows in thick, ghostly tendrils. Spooky, Mark joked, stepping out and stretching. Looks like a scene from a horror movie. Tessa, who had always been more cautious, glanced at the trees with unease. Let's just get set up and stay close to the camp, okay? Logan chuckled. What? Scared of a little fog? But Tessa didn't respond. Something about the way the mist curled and moved unnerved her. It seemed to have a life of its own, like it was watching them. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, even though no one else was around for miles. By the time the tents were up and the fire was crackling, the fog had thickened, settling heavily around the campsite. It swallowed the trees, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, and the night had grown cold, colder than it should have been for early autumn. They sat around the fire, drinking and talking, but there was a strange tension in the air, a heaviness that none of them could explain. The mist made everything feel distant and muted, like they were cut off from the rest of the world. No animals called from the woods, no wind rustled the leaves, just the crackling of the fire and their own voices, low and uncertain. Mark, ever the joker, decided to test the legend. So they say the fog's haunted, he said, his grin mischievous. Apparently people see faces in it, like figures watching them from the mist. Logan laughed, though it sounded forced. Yeah, sure. Probably just shadows or reflections. People freak themselves out over nothing. Tessa wasn't laughing. She had been staring into the fog for a while now, her eyes narrowed. Do you guys see that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan turned, following her gaze, but all he saw was the thick, swirling mist. See what? There, she insisted, pointing, just past the trees. I thought I saw someone. The group fell silent, staring into the fog. At first, there was nothing, just the cold, damp air and the soft glow of the fire. But then, as they watched, shapes began to form. Faint outlines, barely distinguishable from the mist itself, moving slowly between the trees. Who else is out here? Logan muttered, frowning. We're miles from anyone. Mark stood up, squinting into the darkness. Probably just hikers, he said, though there was doubt in his voice. But the figures didn't move like hikers. They glided, drifting in and out of the fog, their forms shifting and elongating. Faces, pale, featureless, flickered in and out of view, watching them from the shadows. And the more they stared, the more the shapes seemed to multiply, filling the fog until it was alive with silent, ghostly watchers. We need to go inside the tents, Tessa said, her voice tight with fear. Now. Logan scoffed. Come on, it's just fog. This is exactly what everyone warned us about, freaking ourselves out over nothing. But Tessa wasn't listening. She had already backed away from the fire, her eyes wide with panic. Logan, she whispered, they're coming closer. Logan turned back toward the mist, and his breath caught in his throat. The figures had moved closer, just at the edge of the firelight now, their pale, hollow faces staring unblinking from the mist. They were clearer now, tall, impossibly thin, with long arms that seemed to reach out toward the group, beckoning them into the fog. Logan took a step back. What the hell? Mark, who had been frozen in place, suddenly snapped out of it. We need to get in the truck. Right now. They scrambled toward the vehicle, but as they moved, the mist thickened, rising up like a wall between them and the truck. The shapes in the fog followed, silent and relentless, their faces shifting, warping as they closed in. Tessa screamed as one of the figures stretched out a hand, the fingers too long, the skin translucent and shimmering like wet paper. She could feel the cold radiating from it, a bone-deep chill that seemed to sap the air from her lungs. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the truck. Come on, come on. But the fog was everywhere now, swirling around them, cutting off their view of the clearing, the trees, even each other. The fire was snuffed out in an instant, leaving only the faint glow of the truck's headlights to pierce the thickening mist. They stumbled, disoriented, toward the truck, but the closer they got, the more the fog seemed to twist, the shapes closing in tighter, their hollow faces watching, waiting. By the time they reached the truck, Logan was trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Get in," he shouted, fumbling with the keys. They piled into the truck, slamming the doors shut just as the mist enveloped the vehicle. The shapes outside pressed closer, their faces peering in through the windows, pale and featureless, mouths opening in soundless screams. The truck's headlights barely cut through the dense fog, illuminating nothing but swirling white and shadows that moved just beyond the reach of the light. Logan turned the key, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. He cursed, trying again and again, but the truck was dead, the cold seeping into the cab, freezing their fingers, numbing their minds. "We're trapped," Mark whispered, staring at the fog, at the faces pressed against the glass. Tessa closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the whispering began, soft at first, like the wind. It filled the truck, the sound growing louder, more insistent, like voices calling from the depths of the fog. "We shouldn't have come here," she muttered, tears running down her face. "We shouldn't have come." For what felt like hours, they sat in the truck, the figures outside growing more and more distinct, their eyes empty, their mouths stretching into wide, unnatural grins. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and the cold had seeped into their bones, leaving them shaking and weak. Suddenly, the fog parted just for a moment. Through the haze, Logan saw a figure standing alone at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't like the others. It was clearer, solid, and it was looking right at him. A woman, her face pale but recognizable, her eyes wide and full of sorrow. It was his sister. The sister who had disappeared 3 years ago, lost in the fog during a late-night drive home. Logan's hand froze on the ignition as he stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. "No." The woman raised a hand, beckoning him. "Logan, don't," Tessa whispered, but he was already opening the door, stepping out into the cold, into the fog. The mist swallowed him whole. When the search party found the truck the next morning, it was parked exactly where they had left it, empty. The fog had lifted slightly, but it still clung low to the ground, swirling around the trees in gentle, ghostly spirals. No one ever found Logan, Tessa, or Mark. The town didn't talk about what had happened. They never did. But those who lived near Fog Hollow knew the truth. And on misty autumn mornings, when the fog creeps low over the road, travelers sometimes report seeing faces in the mist, watching, waiting, their hollow eyes following as the fog swirls around them. And if you look too long, you might see someone you know. The house on Wither Hill. There was a house that sat alone atop Wither Hill, crumbling and forgotten, its windows black and yawning, its roof sagging like a wounded beast. For years, no one dared approach it. The townsfolk had long whispered about what had happened there, about how the family that lived inside had vanished overnight, leaving their supper still warm on the table. The house had remained untouched ever since, abandoned to the creeping ivy and the howling winds. Yet every fall, as the leaves turned to fiery gold and the nights grew long and cold, people claimed to hear strange sounds coming from the house. They said voices echoed from within its walls, soft, pleading voices that drifted down the hill with the autumn wind. Some swore they had seen figures moving through the windows at night, shadows flickering like ghosts, forever trapped in the decaying mansion. Most avoided Wither Hill, especially as October settled in. But for Emily, James, and Katie, the stories were just that, stories. With Halloween around the corner, the three friends had decided that a night spent in the old house would be the perfect way to prove that the tales were nothing more than superstition. They arrived at dusk, just as the sun was sinking behind the hills, casting the house in a crimson glow. The air was cold, sharper than it should have been for that time of year, and the wind rustled through the dead trees that lined the road. The house loomed before them, larger and darker than any of them had expected, a jagged silhouette against the blood-red sky. "This place is a dump," James said with a nervous laugh, kicking at the cracked stone path that led to the door. Katie stared up at the house, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't know, it feels wrong." Emily rolled her eyes. "Come on, it's just an old house. People make up stories because it's creepy looking. We'll be fine." Still, as they approached the front door, even Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, as if the house itself was waiting for them, like a predator lying in wait. The front door creaked open with a groan, the wood splintering as they pushed their way inside. The interior was worse than they'd imagined. Dust thick enough to choke on, peeling wallpaper and furniture draped in old, moth-eaten sheets. But beneath the decay, there was something else, a sense of stillness, as if the house had been frozen in time. The faint smell of something rotten lingered in the air, almost hidden beneath the scent of mildew. James wrinkled his nose. "God, it smells like something died in here." "Probably rats," Emily said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's just set up in the living room. We'll spend the night, take some pictures, and leave in the morning. No big deal." They gathered their things and laid out their sleeping bags in the center of the room. As the last traces of daylight faded from the sky, the house seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing in from the corners. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls, and the whole place groaned like it was alive. Katie shifted uneasily in her sleeping bag. "Do you hear that?" James laughed. "Hear what? The wind? This place is falling apart. Of course it's going to make noise." But Katie shook her head. "No, not the wind. It sounds like someone's talking." Emily paused, straining to listen. At first, all she could hear was the creaking of the house and the gusts of wind rattling the windows. But then, beneath it all, she caught it, a faint, whispering voice, barely audible, as if it was coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. The whispers grew louder as the night went on. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding them, echoing through the halls and stairwells. Sometimes it sounded like a man's voice, low and angry. Other times it was the soft cry of a child, pleading, desperate. The more they listened, the clearer the voices became, overlapping in a chorus of pain and fear. Emily's heart raced. She stood up, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "We need to check upstairs." James shot her a look. "Are you insane? It's probably just old pipes or something." But the voices didn't sound like pipes. They didn't sound like anything mechanical at all. They were too real, too human. Emily couldn't ignore it. "I'm going," she said, her voice firm. "Come with me or stay here." Katie, white as a sheet, reluctantly followed. "I don't think we should split up." The stairs groaned beneath their feet as they made their way to the second floor, every step feeling like a deeper plunge into something they didn't understand. The hallway was narrow, the air colder up here, and the darkness so thick their flashlights barely cut through it. The whispers had grown louder now, more distinct, as though the voices were just on the other side of the walls. As they approached the last door at the end of the hall, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the air around them became so still it felt suffocating. Emily reached out to turn the doorknob, her hand shaking. The door opened slowly, revealing what had once been a bedroom. But it wasn't the rotting furniture or the peeling wallpaper that made her blood run cold. It was the feeling of being watched. Katie gasped, pointing to the far corner of the room. There. At first, Emily didn't see it. But then, her flashlight flickered across something pale, something hunched and motionless in the shadows. It was a figure, small and emaciated, its back to them, crouched like an animal. Slowly, it began to turn its head, the bones in its neck cracking with the movement. As its face came into view, Emily felt her stomach lurch. The thing had no eyes, just hollow, dark sockets that seemed to stretch impossibly wide, a jagged grin slashed across its face. They bolted. All three of them ran, stumbling down the stairs, the air thick with whispers, louder now, almost screaming. The house seemed to pulse around them, the walls tightening, closing in. The front door was within reach. But just as they reached for it, the lights in the room flickered and went out. Everything went still. In the suffocating darkness, they heard a new sound, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the second floor. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy, something that moved with purpose. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. It was coming for them. James fumbled with the door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grasp the knob. Finally, with a violent shove, it swung open, and the three of them burst outside into the freezing night. They didn't stop running until they were halfway down the hill, the house shrinking behind them, the whispers fading into the wind. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, none of them spoke for a long time. The house on Wither Hill loomed above them, silent and dark, its windows black and empty once again. Did you see it?" Katie whispered, her voice trembling. "That thing." Emily nodded, her face pale. "It's not just a house. It's something else. Something inside it." James shook his head, still in shock. "We're never going back there." The next day, they returned to the town, shaken but grateful to be alive. They tried to tell people what had happened, but no one listened. The old folks just gave them that same knowing look, the one they had given before they left. A look that said, "We warned you. We've all seen it too." And in the weeks that followed, none of them could shake the feeling that they had left something behind in their house, something that hadn't finished with them yet. Every now and then, when the wind blew just right, they could still hear it, the soft, faint whispering, calling their names from the top of Wither Hill, waiting for them to come back. The well at Coldbrook Farm. On the outskirts of town, hidden behind miles of untamed forest, stood Coldbrook Farm. The land had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a string of terrible tragedies that no one in the area dared to speak of. The farmhouse itself was a decaying ruin, but there was something far more disturbing about the place, the old well that sat in the center of the yard. They said the well had no bottom, that it went down so far that light could never touch the water. Some claimed that voices echoed up from it late at night, soft whispers that called out to anyone who wandered too close, but no one could say for sure. Coldbrook Farm had been closed off for years, fenced in to keep people from going near it. Yet every autumn, when the leaves turned blood red and the nights grew long, those brave or foolish enough would try to break in just to see if the stories were true. That's how Emma, Ryan, and Jake found themselves climbing the rusted old gate one October evening, the dying sun casting the farm in shadows. The air was heavy, the scent of wet leaves and mold clinging to everything as they made their way up the overgrown path. "This place is creepy as hell," Jake muttered, glancing at the twisted trees that lined the driveway. "I still don't get why we're doing this." Ryan smirked. "Because we're gonna be the first to prove that the well's just a stupid legend." Emma, who had been quiet since they arrived, glanced up at the farmhouse, its windows shattered and sagging, the roof caved in on one side. There was a heaviness in the air, something oppressive, as if the very land itself was warning them to leave. "I don't think we should be here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place feels wrong." Ryan shrugged. "It's just an old farm, Emma. There's nothing here. People love to make up stories to scare each other." But Emma wasn't convinced. Something about the way the wind blew through the trees, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally as they neared the well, it was all wrong. The well sat in the center of the yard, surrounded by a ring of dead grass. It was made of crumbling stones, the surface slick with moss and rot. The wooden cover had long since rotted away, leaving the mouth of the well open, a dark, gaping hole that seemed to breathe with the cold autumn air. Ryan stepped forward, peering over the edge. "Look at this thing," he said, pulling out his flashlight and shining it down. "It goes down forever." Emma stayed back, her stomach twisting in knots. She couldn't bring herself to look at the well. The whispers from the stories, about the voices that rose up from its depths, echoed in her mind. She strained her ears, half expecting to hear them. "Throw something down," Jake said, stepping closer. "See how long it takes to hit the bottom." Ryan grinned, picking up a rock. He tossed it into the well, leaned forward to listen. There was no sound, no splash, nothing. "Huh," Ryan muttered, shining the flashlight down again. The light disappeared into the void, swallowed by the darkness. "It's like there's no bottom." Jake chuckled nervously. Maybe the stories were right after all. As they stood there, a cold breeze picked up, swirling around the well, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul like decay. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, a breath fogging in the sudden chill. Then, from deep within the well, they heard it. A soft, muffled whisper, like someone calling out from far below. Ryan straightened up, his flashlight still aimed at the dark hole. "Did you hear that?" Jake nodded, his face paling. "What the hell was that?" Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but there was something about it that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just a voice, it was voices. Plural. Layered on top of each other, overlapping in a horrible, dissonant chorus. "We need to go," Emma said, backing away. "Now." But Ryan, ever curious, stepped closer to the edge. "Hello," he called down, his voice echoing slightly in the still air. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a new voice rose up from the well, clearer this time, closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural moan, like something in pain, something hungry. Ryan staggered back, his face white as a sheet. What is that?" Before anyone could answer, the air around the well shifted. The wind picked up violently, swirling dead leaves into the air. The darkness inside the well seemed to pulse, growing, expanding as if something was rising from its depths. Jake cursed under his breath, stumbling back. "We've got to go." They ran, sprinting toward the gate, but the wind grew stronger, pushing against them like an unseen force. Behind them, the well groaned, the sound of stone scraping against stone, as if something massive was moving beneath the earth. Emma glanced back, and her blood ran cold. A figure was emerging from the well, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes burned red in the darkness, like embers glowing in the deep. It reached out a hand, fingers impossibly long, the skin cracked and dry. As it moved, the voices in the wind grew louder, no longer faint whispers, but desperate cries, pleading for help, for escape. Emma screamed, pushing herself harder, her legs burning as she ran toward the gate. "Don't look back," she cried, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Ryan and Jake were just ahead, the rusted gate in sight. But as they reached it, the wind slammed the gate shut with a deafening clang, trapping them inside. Jake fumbled with the latch, his hands trembling as the metal refused to budge. Behind them, the figure was closer now, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator playing with its prey. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its feet, the air growing colder with every step it took. Ryan yanked at the gate, his eyes wide with terror. "It's stuck. We can't." Before he could finish, something cold and wet brushed against his arm. He looked down, and his heart stopped. A hand, pale and skeletal, was reaching up from the ground, fingers curling around his ankle, pulling him down. He screamed, kicking at it, but more hands were rising from the earth, clawing their way out of the soil, their grip tightening. Jake turned, trying to pull him free, but it was too late. The hands dragged Ryan to the ground, his screams muffled as the earth seemed to swallow him whole. Emma and Jake finally managed to wrench the gate open, tumbling out onto the road. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the tree line, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. When they looked back, the farmhouse was still there, dark and silent. The well sat in the yard, untouched, the dead grass around it swaying gently in the breeze. But Ryan was gone. In the days that followed, the authorities searched Coldbrook Farm, but there was no sign of him. They found Jake and Emma's story unbelievable, just another case of kids getting scared in an old abandoned place. But they never found Ryan. They never even found a body. It was as if he had simply vanished into the earth, swallowed up by the well. Jake and Emma never spoke about that night again, but every autumn, when the wind howled through the trees and the nights grew long, Emma could still hear the whispers. And late at night, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the well, of the hands reaching up from the dark, of Ryan's face disappearing into the earth, and of the thing that had crawled out of the well, still watching, still waiting for the next fool to wander too close. The well was always hungry. The shadow in the orchard. On the edge of town, nestled between the rolling hills and the thick woods, there was an apple orchard that had been abandoned for years. The trees, once full and lush, now stood twisted and skeletal, their bark cracked and blackened with age. In the fall, the apples would grow in strange shapes, their skin bruised and dark before they even touched the ground. People whispered that the orchard was cursed, that something evil had taken root there long ago. Nobody went near it anymore, except for the occasional group of kids daring each other to sneak in after dark. And nobody stayed longer than a few minutes. The stories about what happened to those who lingered too long were enough to keep most people away. They said that, as night fell, a shadow would move between the trees, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter its domain. Claire, Tom, and Ben didn't believe in ghosts or curses. When they heard the rumors about the orchard, they laughed it off as nothing more than a small-town ghost story, the kind made to scare newcomers or trick kids into staying indoors. But when Halloween rolled around, they decided it was the perfect time to prove everyone wrong. The orchard was even more eerie than they had imagined. As they approached, the air seemed to change. The wind that had been rustling through the nearby fields fell still, and a strange chill settled over them. The trees, bent and gnarled, formed dark silhouettes against the fading evening light, their branches reaching out like claws. "This place is a dump," Tom said with a nervous chuckle, kicking a fallen apple. It squished under his shoe, leaking dark, rotten juice. Ben, always the skeptic, grinned. "Simon, it's just an old orchard. You guys scared already?" Claire didn't answer. Something about the place set her teeth on edge. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every step they took felt heavier than the last. She glanced around at the trees, their crooked forms swaying gently, though there was no breeze. "Let's just go to the center and take some pictures," she said quietly. "We'll prove it's all just a story, then get out of here." They made their way deeper into the orchard, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dead leaves that carpeted the ground. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No rustling, no animals, not even the faint hum of insects. Just silence. Even their voices felt muted, swallowed up by the strange, oppressive stillness. After what felt like hours, they reached the heart of the orchard. There, in the center of the clearing, stood an old wooden cart, half buried in the earth, its wheels rotting and cracked. A long-forgotten harvest, lost to time. The trees here were taller, their branches weaving together in a dense canopy that blocked out the last traces of daylight. "This is it," Ben said, his voice breaking the silence. "Take some pictures and let's head back. I've had enough of this place." Claire pulled out her phone and snapped a few photos of the twisted trees and the old cart. The flash from her phone cut through the gloom, momentarily lighting up the clearing. But in the brief flare of light, she saw something that made her stomach drop. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a shadow. It was tall and thin, almost human in shape, but there was something off about it. It didn't move with the trees, didn't sway with the wind that wasn't there. It just stood there watching them. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, her heart pounding. Ben frowned. "See what?" Claire pointed to where the shadow had been, but it was gone. Tom laughed nervously. "You're just seeing things. This place is creepy, but it's empty." But Claire wasn't convinced. A feeling of being watched hadn't left her. In fact, it had grown stronger, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her from every direction. They started back toward the entrance of the orchard, their pace quickening. But as they walked, the trees seemed to shift around them. What had been a clear path was now twisted and unfamiliar. The gnarled branches loomed closer, their skeletal fingers scraping the sky. The air grew colder, and with each step, the orchard seemed to stretch out further, as though it had no end. "I don't remember the trees being this close," Ben muttered, glancing around uneasily. "We're going the right way, right?" Tom asked, his voice strained. "We just came from here." But Claire knew something was wrong. The path was narrowing, closing in on them. And with every glance over her shoulder, she caught a glimpse of that same shadow, flickering in and out of sight between the trees, always just behind them, always just out of reach. Suddenly, the orchard seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, howling through the branches like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. The trees groaned and creaked, their twisted forms swaying violently as if they were trying to pull themselves free of the earth. "We need to get out of here," Claire shouted, panic rising in her throat. She could feel it now, something dark and cold creeping closer, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadow was moving faster now, slipping between the trees like smoke, growing taller, darker, more defined. It wasn't just following them anymore, it was chasing them. They broke into a run, the twisted path beneath them shifting like a living thing, making it impossible to tell where they were headed. Claire's lungs burned as she sprinted through the dense fog that had suddenly risen from the ground, blurring the world around them. Tom tripped over a root, crashing to the ground with a pained shout. Claire stopped to help him up, her hands shaking. "Come on," she cried, but the moment she glanced up, she froze. The shadow had caught up. It stood directly in front of them now, towering and monstrous, its form shifting and writhing like a living nightmare. Its face, or what passed for a face, was nothing more than a black void, darker than the night itself. It leaned forward, the air around it growing colder, the smell of rotting apples filling their noses. Ben screamed, stumbling back as the shadow reached out with long, clawed fingers, its touch sending a wave of freezing cold through the air. "Run," he shouted. They sprinted in different directions, each of them lost in the maze of twisted trees and thick fog. Claire ran until her legs ached, her mind a blur of panic and fear. The whispering voices surrounded her, the wind biting at her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. At some point, she realized the shadow was no longer following her. The cold that had clung to the air was lifting, and the trees were thinning out. She could see the faint glow of the moon through the branches, signaling the end of the orchard. When she finally stumbled out of the woods and into the clearing where the car was parked, she collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Tom and Ben were nowhere to be seen. Hours passed before Claire gathered the courage to call for help. The police searched the orchard for days, combing every inch of the twisted trees and rotten earth. They found no sign of Tom or Ben. No footprints, no bodies, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished. The townspeople shook their heads, muttering about the curse of the orchard, about how it always took those who stayed too long. Claire tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. In the weeks that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow, tall and looming, its faceless void staring back at her from the darkness. And on quiet, cold nights, when the wind blew through the trees, she swore she could still hear the whispers, faint, distant voices calling out from the orchard. The shadow was still there, waiting, hungry for the next soul foolish enough to step foot among the twisted, cursed trees of the orchard. And Claire knew that, no matter how far she ran, the shadow would never stop following her.